Gather around, children, my children, for it is time for us to have an emergency meeting. Dame Mother Pat McGrath has finally graced us with a new Mothership palette. Mothership 12 Petalmorphosis is arriving on March 20th, which is next week already, actually quite fast. Almost a full 2 years since the release of the last Mothership palette, which was in July 2023, when Mothership 11 Sunlit Seduction was released. I'm going to add immediately, I do not have Sunlit Seduction, I skipped that palette. The way I'm going to do this video, in the first portion of this video, we're going to have a hopefully level-headed discussion with the pros, the cons, my perspective on this palette, what do I think about it, am I going to buy it, why would I buy it, why would I not buy it, because I'm actually still debating. The second portion of this video is going to be trying to dupe the palette with my existing Pat McGrath Labs collection of eyeshadows, because I do have a very extensive existing Pat McGrath Labs collection, so I think that a lot of these shades I can probably dupe as it is, and that's going to be the second part of the video. But before we get into any of that, I want to add a disclaimer. If you saw the reveal of Mothership 12 Petalmorphosis and you thought to yourself, there we go again, pinks and golds, this is not the video for you. Click away right now, because I looked at this palette and I see a lot of things that I can discuss about it. I see a lot of colors, but pink and gold is just not among the colors that I see. So that means you and I fundamentally disagree on how we see color. And I think it's to no one's benefit, it's just a waste of our time to, you know, get on each other's nerves in my comments. You're not going to convince me that this palette is pink and gold, and I'm not going to convince you that it is not pink and gold. So let's just end the discussion right here. I'm sure that you can find plenty of other channels who are going to validate your color interpretation. You might feel validated on a lot of other accounts, but that Petalmorphosis is again pink and gold is not going to be something that I will agree with you on. So if that's something you came to tell me, just click away. And for the rest of you who would like to chat from a more unbiased perspective, then you are more than welcome to hang around. Mother has been teasing that something is coming for about 2 weeks now, because there were a lot of flower-inspired images on her Instagram the last couple of weeks, I want to say, so it was clear that something flower inspired is coming. Now I didn't dare to have my hopes up too much for a Mothership, because after skipping last year it was really unclear whether she discontinued the whole range or she was just taking a break or she was changing up the timing. Now in hindsight, after she revealed that she's been working on a makeup line for Louis Vuitton, it possibly makes a little bit more sense that she skipped a Mothership last year, because if they were leading up to a release this year, it means last year she was probably very busy with that. And as we discussed in one of my previous videos, I just think that the woman, as much as she wants to do everything, she just can't shine her light on every single brand and every single release. So I do think that she's still involved with Pat McGrath Labs, and I do think she sort of like oversees what's going on there, but there is a possibility that she just didn't have time to make a Mothership last year, or that she just decided to take a moment to listen to what we have to say here as customers. So with that, I'm going to lead into, I think, the positives, the pros, all the good things that I see about this palette, because I think that there are good things to be said about the release of this palette. First and foremost, I absolutely love that we're getting a palette in the spring. I mean, I realize it's spring here in the northern hemisphere, and that in other parts of the world it may be leading into fall and winter. I'm very sorry, but most of us here are preparing for spring, and when I saw all the floral inspiration, I was actually kind of hoping for a spring Mothership. So that is exactly what we're getting. Mothership 12 Petalmorphosis is clearly inspired by florals, by spring. There are some greens, some lavenders, some corally shades. You know, I think it's a really good representation of the season, and, you know, to get poetic, the blooming of new life. So I consider that to be like a really positive change. I think it's a good thing to spice things up a little bit. The releases of these palettes, they don't always have to be in July, they don't always have to be themed around the summer or the fall, which I think has been the case for a while. Now, 2 days ago she released her usual teaser where she had, you know, the blurred out image, and it was clearly something that has the size of a Mothership palette. Unfortunately for Pat McGrath Labs, the image of the palette was leaked extremely quickly. I found it on Reddit pretty much as soon as the release was teased. I think Sephora US had maybe accidentally uploaded it on their website or something, I don't know. But basically images of the insides of the palette were circulating already around for 2 days. So it was very funny to me when in her like Mothership Palettes by Pat McGrath Labs on Facebook, there's a group there for the Mothership Palettes. They kept deleting, you know, these posts which show the inside of the palette because it is not allowed to reveal the insides of the palette before the official announcement. And while I get it, it's an official rule imposed by the brand and the mod can't do anything about it, it was like, but what's the point? Everyone's already seen the palette. Everyone was asking for links to where they can see the palette, so I found that super entertaining. I didn't dare to really circulate the image on my Instagram myself because honestly I just didn't want to get into trouble. It's just not worth it. So everyone who messaged me afterwards, I sent them the picture of the palette. Some people I think even had some considerations whether this is an actual real palette or it's one of those like AI generated palettes that we've seen circulating around from people who make fan art with motherships that they would like to will into existence. And I do agree, it bears resemblance to some of those, you know, AI generated images. But I was pretty convinced that this is the real deal because it just fit the bill. The size of the thing looked pretty, you know, comparable. The blurred out image still had the same sort of like color story on the outside that you could recognize, very much inspired by purple and green. And the second positive thing I want to say about this palette is that I actually really like the outside, like the artwork on the packaging. I really like it. I felt like even within the artwork of the packaging, her palettes had started to get so incredibly redundant. And while in the beginning of the brand, when she had all these beautiful different sorts of artwork, that was part of the experience, part of the reason we enjoyed so much those Mothership palettes. At one point they just became so repetitive and so alike looking that even the artwork on the packaging didn't get me excited anymore. So even looking at the cardboard already got me like so excited in such a like positive way. I was like, finally something different. And that brings me to probably the biggest, you know, thing about this palette. Finally something different. We can complain all we want about a bunch of other things when it comes to this palette, but we can all agree that it's different. It's definitely very different compared to all the motherships we have been getting post Divine Rose 1 and Divine Rose 2. Divine Rose 1 and Divine Rose 2 still have their place. They were unique at the time. We love them. But all the palettes that were released after that were just so eerily reminiscent of those Divine Rose palettes that, you know, they just kind of all looked the same, with some shades here and there that might have looked a little bit different. And while I very much like Utopian Dream and Moonlit Seduction, I was really not on board for Sunlit Seduction. I think that palette tanked, and I don't know. For me, that palette didn't do well because it got a lot of negative reviews. I think some people enjoyed it, but for the most part, I only heard negative reviews about this palette. So I think it was really time to release something different. And I'm happy to say that, at least from my perspective, the way I see it, this is different. Finally, we are getting something that is not Divine Rose, the sequel. And that also means that the brand is not completely deaf to our pleads. They have been listening. Maybe they haven't been listening too closely, maybe we haven't been loud enough when it comes to some aspects of the Mothership palettes because they're still not back, but at least they've been listening and they're giving us, you know, something that is different. Now, different also means more colorful, and I think a lot of people have been asking her to do a Mothership specifically that is more colorful. She has released colorful palettes within her limited edition holiday formats, especially those like bigger Mega Mothership palettes. They were all rather colorful, but I've heard repeatedly that people want to have a colorful Mothership. So I'm going to end this, you know, positive perspective on the palette on a high note and say that this Mothership is absolutely a step in the right direction. It's a step in the right direction, but we're not quite there yet. So that brings me to all the negative sides that I can see to this palette, and they are not few. First and foremost, like I said, apparently we haven't been loud enough because the Blitz Astro shades are still not back in their original delicious, please bring it back, baked formula. Let me be completely clear, that is not a speculation, that is not a, ooh, I think they're not baked. No, they're 100% not baked. You can see in every image of the palette that there are metal pans, they do not look raised, they do not have that like dry finish to them. They're absolutely for certain there is not a single baked shade in this palette. And I've seen a lot of comments about the baked shades. I think for a while only few of us were really raising their voice when it comes to the baked formula being brought back. But now I'm hearing more and more people, I'm seeing more and more in her comments, in her group and on her Instagram asking about where are our baked shades. We were not born yesterday and we are onto you. We see that you call them Blitz Astros, but they ain't baked. So I'm very happy to see that people are becoming more vocal about it, because I'm hoping that ultimately, after they listened to us about bringing something different, they're also going to bring back the Blitz Astro shades in the original baked formula. So that is a huge con, you know. Already starting off from that point, I was disappointed so much not to see the baked shadows back in the palette. That brings me to another concern about the Blitz Astro shades. And now the question is, are they going to be more akin to the one in Mothership 10 Moonlit Seduction, where they were not baked, but at least they were impactful and still beautiful and easy to work with? Or are they going to be more similar to the Blitz Astro shades that were present in Sunlit Seduction? And a lot of creators seem to suggest that these Blitz Astro shades are not even the same formula as the one that was present in Moonlit Seduction, and they're definitely a step down in terms of the quality, in terms of how impactful they are, in terms of how interesting they are. There was one shade in particular, like a reddish shade in the top right corner of the palette, that was also very difficult to work with, very chunky, a very unpleasant texture, very like cheap feeling texture. Now all of this is hearsay. I do not have Sunlit Seduction. I've swatched it in store, and what I remember was just not being super impressed by the formula of the special shades, the Blitz Astro shades. So that is a really valid concern. At the very least, I'm hoping that what we are getting is more similar to Moonlit Seduction. But I will say this, based on what I'm seeing from swatches and just like images of the actual palette, I'm a little afraid that we're not really getting very interesting Blitz Astro shades, because it almost seems like we're just getting mattes and metallic shimmery shades with some sparkle and possibly some which are a bit more duochromatic. I just don't see these shades, at least visually from swatches and from what the palette looks like in videos. They just don't look to be very interesting in the sense that they don't seem to be very multidimensional. They don't seem to be the types of shades that you can, you know, layer or play around with to create different sort of effects. There don't seem to be maybe like one or two somewhat more duochromatic shades, at least from what I can tell. There isn't much interesting going on. With that, I want to bring back another point though. Of course, we have the Decadence palette. The Decadence palette Mothership 4 doesn't have a single Blitz Astro shades. It's all satins and metallics. This one is a little different because there are a couple of mattes in here, but it is not completely unheard of that she brings out a Mothership that doesn't really have those like interesting shifty shades. So if they were going for a concept like the Decadence palette, that I can understand where they're coming from with this palette, but at the same time they're calling a bunch of these shades. I want to say they're calling 5 of these shades, which is also the first time that they're calling 5 of the shades in the Mothership palettes Blitz Astros. Usually they're restricted to 4, like Blitz VR or Astros, and I want to say now that there are 5 of them. But at the same time, they don't really look like Blitz Astros, they look like regular metallics. And that was the complaint that people had about Sunlit Seduction, that some of these Blitz Astro shades that were in the corner where usually the shifty, interesting and unique shades are located, they just felt like regular, barely even interesting and duochromatic metallic shades. Something else that I think is going to turn a lot of people off is the palette is quite colorful. There are a few somewhat more neutral shades, but for the most part, if you look through the palette, it's clearly meant to be a more colorful palette, so it is more intimidating. It is not going to be for everyone, so I can see this being a palette that satisfies a very like small group of people. So it's also a very bold and risky move on their side to release such a colorful palette within the Mothership range, because they're quite expensive, and if only a few people buy it, then it's not going to send a good message. We're never going to get another colorful palette like this if this one tanks. How do I personally feel about it is, a couple of years ago I would have been absolutely elated to get a palette like this, but now I'm boring and beige, and I'm not intimidated by this palette. I know how to work color, but I can see how this palette is going to be something that I use a bit like I use the Decadence palette. I use it as a box of candies that I reach into every now and then to give a little bit of a colorful twist to my looks, to my more neutral leaning looks these days, but it's not a palette where I'm like, oh, I can't wait to create like 15 different colorful looks with it. Of course, if I buy it, I'm going to do a week off and we're going to do all the colorful looks, but for my personal current taste, my taste has changed and this palette is not necessarily anymore my personal taste. Do I want a green and taupe mothership with baked shades, like baked, delicious baked taupes? Yes, I do. Yes, I have my perfect mothership palette in mind. And am I ever going to get that? I don't know. I don't know if I'm ever going to get that, but if we're going about what each individual person wants from her, yeah, then we're never going to get it and we're never going to stop complaining. So I think we should just, you know, take a step back and see the positive in this. But before we see the positive in this, I have one more negative point, and I think that's going to be also like a good segue into the dupes portion of this palette. So the palette is quite colorful and the palette is, you know, really cheerful, very vibrant. But is it colors that we don't already have, even within the Pat McGrath Labs range? Unfortunately, it is not. We have all of these colors, or most of these colors, or a version of these colors. I don't think that anyone is delusional about the fact that at this point Mother has given us, I don't know, something in the ballpark of altogether 50 palettes. So there is probably no way we're going to get new colors, because there are only so many colors that exist within the visible spectrum of light, and we've gotten them all. Between all the palettes that she has released, we've gotten them all. We can argue that there are some very interesting duochromes or multichromes or like sparkly shades. Yes, I can concoct a bunch of them in my head, but overall, when it comes to color, we've seen it all, we have it all. So this palette doesn't bring anything unique in terms of colors. You have to see it as a color story. You have to see it as, you know, specific tones of shades that work well together. Are they going to work for you? That kind of thing. But am I going to buy the palette? I'm leaning towards buying it, but I will be completely honest with you, I'm still trying to understand myself and whether I want to buy it because it's been 4 years since I bought a mothership. Like I said, I haven't bought a mothership palette since Moonlit Seduction, so am I going to buy this palette because I just am itching to buy a mothership, or because I really want it? I'm also very concerned about those Blitz Astro shades that are not looking Blitz astrally at all, and they just look like metallics. And then I think, well, if I already have the better version of these in the baked formulas from Pat McGrath herself, what am I doing purchasing this palette? I don't buy things for you and for this channel. I don't buy things for the channel. I buy things for the Mariam. And Mariam doesn't like to clutter her collection with things she's not going to use or she's unsure of. Those days are behind me. So I want to bring in something that I know I'm going to get a lot of use and joy out of. I'm thinking, do I want to maybe wait out to see Alicia Archer's video, because she mentioned that she is going to get the palette, and maybe decide only afterwards? Am I going to be able to resist the urge to buy the palette on the release day? I think something that might make it easier to skip the palette when it releases is that last time they didn't have the, you know, 10% discount code on the day of the release, like the VIP early access code did not come with a discount code. There was no 10% off. So if they're not giving me a discount, there's literally no like incentive for me to buy it on launch day. So I'm leaning towards, let's say it's a 60% yes, but there's still a solid 40% which is leaning towards a no. To be TBD, I will let you know. We will see. I don't know. Right now I'm undecided. And with all of these considerations in mind, the question now is how close can we get to Petalmorphosis if we just dig back into our existing Pat McGrath Labs collections. Like I said, I've got a pretty extensive one, so I think we have a good, you know, variety of shades to choose from. I have all the shades written down here, and I thought more or less yesterday which shades might be similar in my collection. So if you see me looking down a lot, I'm just looking a lot at my iPad. Oh, before I forget, a very important detail. The mothership is going to release in 2 different packaging options. You're going to have the original black lacquer, and there's going to be a lavender version of it. My personal take on the lavender version, I have to tell you, when I saw it, it really threw me off. I think it really, like, all of these different colors against the lavender backdrop is giving an error in my brain, so I'm actually not into it. I'm just going, if I purchase it, it's definitely going to be in the black lacquer packaging. So the first eyeshadow is going to be Divine Dawn, and Divine Dawn is located in a position where usually in a mothership palette we have a skin show shade. Let me give you an example. So this is Divine Rose 2, and usually in the position where she currently has, you know, the Divine Dawn shade right here, there is a skin show shade, and the skin show shade is usually a satin that is meant to be used as a inner corner highlight, also as a very light lid shade. It seems like this palette doesn't really have a skin show shade, because the shade Divine Dawn actually looks to be quite sparkly and even duochromatic. To me, this shade appears to be something like a light peachy, pinky, leaning towards maybe even the cooler pink duochrome. I can't think of anything in her collection right now that is closer in mind than the Astral, one of the Blitz Astral shades that is actually present in the Divine Rose 2 palette. And that is the shade Astral Pink Moon. So I'm actually going to take Astral Pink Moon, because I think in my collection that is probably the closest shade in terms of the shifts, and also the fact that it is a sparkly, glittery shade. I do think that this shade is definitely warmer, and the new shade has somewhat more pink sparkles to it. So please correct me if you can think of an eyeshadow that is more similar to Divine Dawn. Please let everyone know in the comment section. This was the closest that I could think of, or something that would maybe satisfy a similar need. The next shade I'm going to try to dupe is the shade Nocturnal Bloom, and Nocturnal Bloom is a matte green. And what I wanted to add about this shade is that this specific dark forest green matte has been in my ideal mothership palette, in my dream mothership palette for a while, because my dream mothership palette is a green and taupe palette, and a matte dark green was present in my ideal mothership. So I'm very happy that there is one in the new mothership. Now the only similar eyeshadow that I can think of within Pat's range comes from the Celestial Nirvana palette, and it is this one over here. Now I do think the new one, the one in the Petalmorphosis palette, is darker and possibly not as blue toned. This one is, I think, rather blue toned, and I want to say that the one in the mothership Petalmorphosis looks to be a lot deeper in tone and more of a true forest green, and leaning more towards the green than the blue. So this is the closest that we can get currently in Pat's collection, but I do think that possibly the Nocturnal Bloom shade is quite unique to Pat's range. Next up we have another matte, and that is the shade Twilight Lilac. And this is one of the shades that I find difficult, because depending on how the light hits it in different photos, it looks to be either a more cool toned purple or one of those, you know, classic burgundy aubergine type purples that Pat loves to give us. If it's the latter, I'll be really disappointed. If it's the first, I look forward to it, because I do love cooler toned purples. Now the only eyeshadow that I could think of in my collection that is rather similar is the matte purple here from the Bridgerton 1 palette. This is a beautiful cooler toned purple. I do still think that this is a somewhat more mauve leaning purple compared to the one in Petalmorphosis, excuse me. Petalmorphosis appears to be possibly a little bit deeper in tone and a little bit more cool toned, and not as much mauve, but like I said, it's very hard to tell. Next up we have the shade Astral Iridescent Iris. So it's interesting because this is in the smack middle of the mothership palette, and it's very unusual, or it has never happened before, that there's been an astral palette in astral shade in that specific portion of the palette. Usually they are reserved for the corner here in the right corner. So the shade that we're talking about seems to be a duochrome, and I don't know that I can think of a spot-on dupe for it, but the closest I could think of, because there appears to be multicolor shimmer here. So this could go either way. This could be very similar to something like Lavenderic from the Risque Rose Squad, or it could be very similar to something like this. So this is the lilac-y shade that I don't know the name of because I'm terrible. Astral Lilac Aura. So this is already from the Mothership Moonlit Seduction, where the shades are not baked anymore. So this is actually more similar also in terms of its texture and formula to the one that's in the new palette. Now this palette is, this shade, excuse me, this specific shade is very light, very pastel, quite cool toned, and it is a beautiful lilac shade. I do think that the one in the new palette seems to have more sparkly, like more multi-dimensional sparkle going to it. This one doesn't have like different color sparkle to it. It's just this beautiful fairy light lavender, really pretty. Next we have the shade Cosmic Fantasies, and Cosmic Fantasies looks to be a metallic burgundy, and the first metallic burgundy that immediately came to my mind is this beautiful shade right here, which was present in her just released holiday palette for 2024. This is the Luminous Legends palette. So this eyeshadow is absolutely beautiful. It's in the Italian Quint formula. I call it the Quint formula. This is such an incredibly beautiful shade. I think this might be a pretty spot on dupe for the shade in the new palette. Here we have, I think, something that is quite close to the new palette. Not much to say about this shade. It appears to just be a regular metallic without any like interesting shifts to it. So it's a pretty shade, but absolutely not something we haven't seen from Pat before. All right, let's talk about the next shade. The next shade is called Lunar Nectar, and Lunar Nectar is one of those abominations that we should agree to call a crime. It appears to be matte with glitter in it. I know some people enjoy this type of formula. I'm sorry, I'm just a hater. I really dislike matte eyeshadows with glitter because it seems to me like it's the type of formula that doesn't know what it is. If you use it as a matte, all the glitter flies away. If you try to use it as a metallic, the glitter doesn't quite stick or appear impactful. So it's really doing nothing on both accounts. So I don't understand what it wants to be, and this is an abomination and a formula that I absolutely despise. But I did think of actually a very similar shade from one of the Quints that was released 2 years ago with the Holiday 2023 collection. Now, Lunar Nectar appears to have a little bit more of like a terracotta undertone to it, and the one from this Quint here, this is the Quint in the shade Bordeaux Bliss, and this is the eyeshadow we're talking about. This possibly leans a little bit more purple, so maybe I will give you two options here, because this one is closer in terms of the finish, but not so much in terms of the color. So here we have this shade, but I think this is too purple for what I see in the palette. What I see in the palette actually reminds me a little bit more of the terracotta matte that we have here in Moonlit Seduction. So possibly in terms of the undertone, this is much more similar. I don't mind this shade, but I also don't love it, and it's not one of my most used mattes from Pat. That's possibly a mistake because it's actually a really beautiful shade. But I think if you take this shade and you put glitter in it, like there is in this shade, then you will get Lunar Nectar. And if you use Lunar Nectar as a matte, which is probably the intended use of that shade, you're not going to see much of that glitter. So I think the closest we can get in terms of undertone is this one here from Moonlit Seduction. And now we're getting into the corner of the Blitz Astral shades, but like I said, they just look like regular metallics to me. So let's talk about one of the most exciting shades in the palette, and that is the shade Astral Eden Envy. Astral Eden Envy honestly appears to be the subpar metallic version of our beloved baked Gigabyte shade. It is present in the Mothership 3 Subversive, but it is also present in the Bridgerton 2 palette. She gave them different names, but essentially they're the same eyeshadow. So this is the eyeshadow that I'm referring to here. Now, I will say this, the one in the new palette appears to be a little bit more of a brighter chartreuse, because Gigabyte still has a very smoky undertone to it. But I do think that they're rather similar, and something we have to agree on right now, I'm not going to even dispute this, this is the better shade, this is the superior shade, because it comes in the delicious baked formula. This is one of the most beautiful eyeshadows that I have ever seen. So here we have my beloved Gigabyte. Like I said, I do think that because of the smoky base, this is not the same shade. I think this new shade is going to be a little bit more somewhat brighter version of Gigabyte delivered in a metallic formula. It's really too bad that she didn't make it like a full-on like lime green chartreuse, because I think that would have been really fun. Keep in mind that I don't think that they're going to be exact dupes of each other. Now, speaking of exact dupes of each other, I think the next shade is actually the only one that I could not come up with any shades in Pet's collection that are dupes for this, and that is the shade, I actually love the name of the shades, Blitz Radiant Rhapsody. Blitz Radiant Rhapsody appears to be a bright green blue turquoise loaded with multicolored sparkle. There is no shade like this in Pet's collection, really. I am going to give you an alternative which is not going to be the same though, and that comes from the Nocturnal Nirvana quad, where we have this absolutely stunning turquoise aqua shade right here, which also comes in our beloved baked formula. So I do think the new one is going to be much more green toned, deeper in tone, and altogether not the same. But if you wanted to have something that is close by in tone and possibly effect, then we've got this one here from Nocturnal Nirvana. Okay, the next shade also gave me a little bit of trouble. That is the shade Astral Sunset Splendor. Astral Sunset Splendor, at least to me, appears to be like an apricot orange with sparkle to it. And we've got oranges from Pat, but I don't know that really have like those lighter, more like apricot, peach, pastel type oranges. And the only sort of like apricot shade that I could think of is not close at all to the finish that's going to be in the new palette, because I think that's a much sparklier eyeshadow. But the only one I could think of was one of the original Queens that was released in 2021 or 2022. I don't know when these were originally released, the Queen formula. So this is in the shade Nude Allure, and the shade that I'm talking about is right here. This is the shade Coral Kiss. Coral Kiss is again in the beautiful Italian Queen formula, but it is probably not going to be as sparkly as the one that is in the new palette. I think this one comes the closest in terms of having the correct like apricot-y, light apricot-y undertone, but I think the new one is probably going to be a lot sparklier. Now, a shade that I have like 5 options for, the last shade in the palette is Blitz Bronze Supernova. Pat has given us so many bronzes to choose from, so it's very difficult to even like point to one. But I am going to give you one beautiful bronze. This bronze shade is present here from another holiday Queen. This was from last year, 2023. This is one of my favorite palettes from Pat McGrath Labs. This is in the shade Bronze Ecstasy, and the shade that we're talking about is right here. This is the shade Enchanted Bronze. Enchanted Bronze again is in the Queen formula, but it has a very good amount of sparkle to it as well. So I do think that in terms of that last shade, you've got plenty of options to choose from. This is just one that I'm giving you. Here again is my little dupe palette for you. I don't know, what do you guys think about it? Did we come close to duping Petalmorphosis, or do you still think that we are quite far off? I have to tell you, I'm surprised, because I thought if I swatch the dupes that I have in my collection, I will be completely convinced that I don't want to buy Petalmorphosis. But when I started swatching, I realized that there are a lot of like nuances to these new shades that are not quite the same as what we have in the previous palette. So I'm more willing to see the uniqueness in the new palette now that I've swatched what I have. If you don't want these exact shades from the Petalmorphosis palette, and you don't mind some differences, you know, in the tones, in the nuances of the shades, you just care for a similar color story, or like similar colors in your Pat McGrath Labs collection, then you've already got everything, and probably some of them even in better formulas, because they're still in the original baked formulas. But if you want these specific shades, then I think that for a lot of these there are no one-on-one dupes in Pat McGrath Labs' collection, so there's a little bit more uniqueness to the palette than honestly I anticipated just by my initial expectations. So I'm actually pleasantly surprised. Alright, you guys, I think I'm going to hereby close our emergency meeting. I think I've said everything that I wanted to say. At this point, I have nothing more to add. We will see what I decide on the 20th in terms of purchasing the palette on release day, whether I will wait a little bit or I will not have any patience. I'm undecided on that point. I can't wait to hear all of your thoughts in the comment section. If you can think of better dupes, please let us know, because I think everyone is curious and interested about it. Thank you so very much for watching. Again, if you see pink and gold, please do not comment. I'm not going to respond. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!